So now that we've identified the changes that we need to make in our application, let's write some tests to actually guide our refactor. We're going to start with the user model here, since that's where all the authentication goodness is happening. And we're going to create a new test file. So we'll say touch models/user.test.js. Aha, there it is. And let's add a few test cases to it. Let's import what's in the user? Does it have this? Great. Let's import that because we will need it. Actually, let's import both of these. Might as well, right? Cool. Bad request error, unauthorized error. I think that's all we need for now. And then let's create a new dummy user. We'll say const new user equals username fake user. Email is fake@user.io. And isAdmin is false. And then let's describe the user model. And we'll say, we'll test, or actually let's describe it. Let's put another describe block in here. We'll describe test user registration. We want to test the registration method on the user model. So we'll test that the user can successfully register with proper credentials. And it will be an async function, since we're going to do some async work here, that will create a user. We'll say const user equals await user.register . Oh, did it import user for me? Oh, that's probably smart. I should have imported the user. I was about to say something changed there. Okay, so let's register the new user, and then let's give that new user a password of PW for password. Then we'll expect that user to equal ID, which will be any number, and the username, which should be equal to the new user.username. And we'll do the same thing for email. And the same thing for isAdmin. Oops. There we go. And let's also have the created at field equal to a date. Okay, there we go. That seems to work, right? Then let's copy this test and let's create two more. The second one will say registering with duplicate email throws an error. And in it, we will do a few things. Actually, the first thing, let's put this here. Expect.assertions should be 1. And this is essentially just saying, hey, Jest, I want you to know that in this test, we're requiring at least one assertion call. If it doesn't get at least one assertion call, or actually exactly one assertion call, it'll fail this test. And then we're going to try, and we'll just do the same thing here. We'll await registering our user, and then we will do it again. But this time, we will change the username, so that it has a different username, to something else, and it'll keep the same email. Now we're doing that because we want it to throw an error. So we'll catch that error, and we will expect that error instance of bad request error to be truthy. To be truthy. Beautiful. And we'll do the same thing here, but we'll do this for username also. So registering with duplicate username should also throw an error. And so we'll change the email to something else, something at else.io. Cool. So basically all we're doing here is we're making sure that if a user signs up with the same email, that we throw an error. If a user signs up with the same username, we throw an error. And these are some solid tests. And so when we run these tests with npm test -- user.test.js, we should see them fail. Okay, one failed. Uh-oh. This is interesting. There's this weird thing where Jest notified us that it hasn't exited yet. And there's actually a good reason for that. It's because we didn't end our connection to the database. And if you remember from our app.test.js right here, we have this after all global hook where we actually did end the connection to the database. After all the tests are run, I want you to await db.end. And we do need this. So we'll need to ensure that happens as soon as our tests finish running. Otherwise, Jess will throw this interesting error right here. So let's exit out of there. And let's add that. Let's just add it at the top of our file right up here. Totally fine. Doesn't matter where we put it. And again, this is just a global hook that Jest provides us with. Now, this after all function runs at the conclusion of all tests, but there are also things like before all, before each, after each, other global hooks like that. So we'll get to those in a moment. For now, we see that one of our 3 tests is failing. The other 2, let's see. Okay, the other 2 are passing. Interesting. I wonder why that is. So user can successfully register with proper credentials is the only one that's failing. Cool, that's good to know. But we also see that the reason why this first test failed is that it said a user already exists with the email fake@user.io. But wait a minute. We didn't enter in that user before. There's something fishy is going on here. Let's change this username a little bit. Fake user2. And we'll say fake2@user.io. And let's run this test one more time and see what happens. Interesting. Okay. Let's see what happened here. Okay. So now it failed for a different reason. It said user can successfully register with proper credentials. Cool. And it's expecting that the registered user should have a username, and it doesn't. But there's something interesting here. Why did that test fail previously in a different way than it failed now? Well, there's a good reason for that. And it's mainly because we already have, at least at the moment, we already have some dummy data in the database. But when we add a new user like this, at fake user, we're inserting that new data into our testing database. And that data persists for the duration of the testing session. In fact, it persists, period. So once we've added it to the testing database, there's no way to pull it back out unless we do that manually. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's actually do that by updating our rate my setup SQL schema. There we go. This one right here. Rate my setup schema.sql. I couldn't say that for a second for some reason. And let's give it the username field that it needs. We'll say text not null unique, so that it is unique, so that that fail works correctly. And then let's go ahead and give our users some usernames. We'll say this one is person, this one is them, and this one is you. Cool. So that we now have a username entered in for each of these users. That's good. And then let's actually go back into our database and let's run this again. Let's reset up our database with psql-f rate my setup.sql. Cool. Let's recreate it. Drops it. Adds them. Looks good. Cool. Nothing wrong there. Now, let's actually go ahead and take advantage of the fact that in our user test.js, we're using this after all hook here. But let's take advantage of the before all, before each, and after each hooks to ensure that we get a fresh set of default users in the database for each test run, so that if we don't run this test multiple times, like if I run this test again, it's going to fail for a different reason because fake user 2 now exists in the database. And we see now that all three tests failed. Oh boy. Registering a duplicate username throws error. Looks like it didn't. Registering with duplicate email throws error. Looks like it didn't. And null value in column username violates not null constraint. Okay, so there's a bunch of interesting errors going on here. And we're going to have to manage all of these manually, but it's a good time to start simplifying our testing framework a bit. So to do that, we're going to create a new directory called tests. And inside that directory, we're going to create a new file called common.js, which is going to help manage our sessions so that we don't add the same user database twice and have to worry about any of that silly nonsense. So in this file here, we're going to say const db equals require ... /db.js. Then we're going to create an async function called common before all. And we'll run any database actions here. We want to take before the tests, like seeding it if we wanted to. And then we'll have another one here called common before each. And this will run before each test, individual test. And in it, we will await db.query begin. Oh, what is that? Well, this right here, along with the common after each, which we will say db.query roll back, these two things, these two common hooks, will be used to wrap each test in a database transaction. And a database transaction is just, again, if you're unfamiliar with them, if you're familiar with transactions, you'll understand kind of what's happening here. But if you're unfamiliar, essentially they just represent all or nothing blocks of SQL queries. So we're able to execute multiple queries inside a transaction block, and either every query succeeds and the results are committed, or any of them fail and they all fail and the results are rolled back. Here we're simply carrying out that process manually, beginning the transaction before each test and rolling it back at the end. So this way, any changes made in one test are not persisted to the next. And that's actually much more in line with what we want. So then at the end, we can just say common after all. And we'll await db.end, like before. Now let's just export these. Module.exports equals common before all, common before all, common after each, common before each. Cool. Now we do this so that in our test user.js or user.test.js, we can import them. Const common before all. Oh, let's just, you know what? Let's just take this thing right there, because typing is becoming very painful. It's like const is equal to require ... tests / common. And then we can simply call them with all of our global hooks that Jest provides us. So we'll say before all. VS Code just really does not like these Jest globals. Before all, before each, say common before all, common after all, and we'll say before each and after each. And so all of these should make sure that our testing system, that each of these tests are handled individually, and after every test, whatever database interactions happened are rolled back in the transaction. So now, again, if we run these tests, we can see that they're failing because we're not actually registering user with the username, and so none of this is working like we want it to. It's time to make those tests pass. So let's go ahead and update this user model with a new method. So this one right here, called fetch user by email, let's create one called fetch user by username. And instead of email, we'll use username all over the place. So it's basically the same function, but instead of an email, we're using a username. And the reason we need that is just so that we can look up a user by their username to make sure that, hey, if that user exists in the database already, throw an error. And then we can update our register function with to make sure that the username exists. And let's also check to see, hey, does a user exist? Const existing user, let's say with username. And we'll fetch that user by username with the credentials.username. And then we'll say a user already exists with username. Ta-da! And so let's also normalize the username. And make sure we actually insert that user with their username into the database. Cool. And normalized email. We also need the normalized username. And that looks pretty nice. Nothing else too crazy there. we simply check for the existence of the username field, ensure it's not a duplicate, and then, or right here, and then lowercase the username, and then insert the user into the database with that username. And so then all we need to do is come in here and make sure that whenever we make a public user, we include their username. Cool. Now let's run our test again and see what happens. Ah, look at that. They're all passing. And so now we know there's our green. Our tests are passing. That means we can register users with username. And it works. That's magical. Now there's still some work to be done since this is just the user model. The register model. We didn't even test the login or any of the other stuff, but that's less important. But now it's time to take a look at the auth routes and middleware to make sure that they follow the same pattern. But before we do that, let's save our work. Git status, git add, git commit, registering users with username. Great. And we're ready to go.